We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Exclusive videos weekly on all the social media platforms. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Joe Matera is this episode's guest. He is the author of the book Backstage Pass, The Grit and the Glamour. Joe is a musician and rock journalist who's interviewed artists from all over the world, covering the full spectrum of genres. His book, Backstage Pass, takes the reader to the backstage and beyond to get behind the facade of the rock stars he's met. He shares stories of his experiences interviewing Nickelback, Lemmy from Motörhead, The Shadows guitarist Hank Marvin, and John Mayer. He recalls the time a member of Death Cab For Cutie blew off his interview, explains why he thinks the metal community is so misunderstood, how he approaches asking musicians difficult questions, and how do you survive the wear and tear of touring. We get to all of that in this episode, so let's get right to it. Here is Joe Matera. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Outstanding book. I loved it. What a fascinating read. This gives you insight into what it's like to be a rock journalist, what it's like to be a musician on the road, the crazy life that it is. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what got you into becoming a rock journalist and a musician.
Well, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. And first and foremost, I'm a musician. So I picked up guitar at the age of 15. And I come from the school of classic rock artists, like everybody from Queen, Van Halen, all that sort of stuff. But I sort of did learn a lot of other styles of music as a guitar player. So guitar's always been my main love of an instrument. How I got into journalism, I've always loved writing. It's interesting because even from school, one of my best subjects was just writing in English class, and I sort of fell into music journalism. I mean, when the internet happened in the early 90s, I was on it pretty quick, and I saw the sort of development of where it was going, and there's some early music sites, so I used to check out some of these fan sort of sites, and I noticed there were like email addresses. I thought, oh yeah, you can actually contact people. So I just sent a couple of emails to a few sort of artists that I sort of liked, and I got responses, and I thought, oh okay, maybe I could ask them a few questions about some of my favorite albums, and one of the very first ones who actually did that for me was Andrew Gold, who passed away a few years ago. He had a big hit in the 70s called Lonely Boy, and he was gracious enough to sort of answer all my questions, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is sort of a bit of an interview. So I wrote it all up, and I thought, see if someone wants to publish this. So I approached a songwriter magazine in Ireland, and they were sort of running all these sort of songwriter interviews, and they checked it out and said, oh, we really love this. We'll publish it for you. And I thought, oh, wow, great, And then the big surprise came when they said, and we'll pay you for it. And I go, really? Okay. So that sort of got me my mind going. I'm thinking, oh well, this is something that is quite fun, and I could get paid for. So I basically just started sort of writing, for like local street press, and it took me quite a number of years to sort of reach the position where I was able to sort of get some access to big name stars and that sort of stuff. But the big breakthrough came, as I mentioned in my book, when I got to sort of meet and interview Nickelback. Now at that time, Nickelback in Australia, they weren't big. They were just starting to break. They had their sort of single out, How You Remind Me, but it wasn't doing anything much. And so I happened to be there at the right time, at the right place, interviewed him. The interview sort of got published as one of the very first interviews I did. And about like 3 months later, they were huge. And they came back to Australia, and they asked for me to interview them again. And basically I interviewed them for a number of years over that period. And from that interview, basically all the others started happening. My name got out there, and here I am today after, 20-something years doing this, and hundreds of interviews I've done.
It's like a snowball effect, and that snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Absolutely. It's not, I read books where they say sort of sometimes, where people say, look, I had a plan. I wanted to do this when I, growing up or whatever. And it's like, I never had that sort of plan. I just fell into it. I just followed my passion, and things presented themselves to me, and I sort of grabbed them and ran with it. I mean, not knowing what the result will be. So same as my book. I never knew I would end up writing a book. I do keep diaries, and I think that's one of the things that was my savior, in the sense that I could remember things and in detail. So if I didn't have a diary, it would have been a lot more harder for me to sort of recall a lot of moments, because there's been so many, and like everything else, when you look back on things, you go, oh, I can't remember that. But when you read your diaries, you go, oh, I did that. And then all of a sudden, all these other memories start to sort of be recalled, and you paint a bigger picture, which is really cool.
Yeah, and this book is not so much about the rock stars and the bands you've met, much like finding out how an album or song is constructed. This book pulls back the curtains to see what really goes into the process of being in a band and what it's like being a rock journalist, right? That was the goal of this book?
Absolutely, yeah. Look, one thing I read over I've read so many music, autobiographies and bios, and it's always about the sex, drugs, rock and roll, and it gets tiring after a while, because like how many sort of stories can you read that are sort of repeated, and a lot of times those stories are sort of exaggerated. Motley Crue is a classic example. Yep, a lot of those things did happen, but there's a lot of things that didn't happen, and I'm pretty much I know Tom Werman, who was their producer of those 3 classic Motley Crue albums, and he told me a lot of stories about what happened, and a lot of them, he dispelled a lot of myths that we take for granted as being, oh, Motley Crue did that, So I wanted to write a book from the perspective of showing readers what it's like behind the scenes in regards to the amount of work involved, the perseverance, the boredom, because there's a lot of times where, touring, it's not this glamorous procession where you're touring in, checking out countries and that sort of stuff. It's about getting to the next show, to do your show for the audience. And a lot of times you don't get much chance to sort of look around. So it's about getting sound check, having a rest. So there's a lot of sleeping, eating, rehearsing, performing, and onto the next town. So I wanted to show people the reality of what it is. But at the same time, there's some great stories. This is the building of characters of artists that we've grown to love, and what it's like. So I'm not saying that sort of stuff like the sex, drugs, rock and roll doesn't happen. I didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to focus more on showing people that they're great artists that they love are just like you and I, humans, really down to earth, wonderful people. You'll be surprised at the amount of metal guys I've met who are just so down to earth, so wonderful. And you wouldn't think from the image they portray. But again, it's all about the persona, the public persona, which I delve into it fairly much in my book.
That's what I want to ask you about in terms of, well, specifically Nickelback. So you interview them while they're still fairly unknown, right? The first single's out, then they become huge. In fact, it's funny because you told your editor, get these guys on the front page. No.
That's right.
You were able to say, I told you so. But when you interview them again and they are now famous, any change? Do you notice any change in the personality of a band before and after fame hits?
Look, one thing I did notice that changes is the entourage obviously got bigger, because there were much more. There's a lot more people involved in it. At that time, I mentioned a book about because they were so big, and there was a backlash to Nickelback, as you know. Like there's sort of everybody was in about hate Nickelback, and I could never understand it, because basically Nickelback was, it's just they were successful at a formula that they did, and good luck to them. As musicians, don't we all want to be sort of our music for the mass audiences, So. And I remember, like Kerrang! Were one of the magazines that really sort of, really laid into sort of Nickelback, and Chad really didn't like that. He really was pissed off about that sort of stuff. So, but look, the change, and look, they were the same as when I first met them. They obviously they were a lot more confident. They knew what they wanted now, because they were pretty successful. But I didn't see much of a change from when I first met them to over the next couple of interviews I did with them. Yeah, apart from the big entourage and obviously the quality of where they were staying. Apart from staying from smaller motels, they were now staying in nice, luxurious hotels in the city. That's
great to hear, though. They didn't change. But you said Chad, you're referring to Chad Kroeger, who's the singer and the guitarist, and I think the main songwriter. Is he the main guy?
He's the main songwriter, yeah. So, and the other thing, Eric, the other thing to mention is Chad also, and like other bands I've interviewed, once they understand what sort of journalist you are, and because I was a musician too, they could relate to me on that sort of mind level. They know I wasn't there for tabloid, headline, because if I was there just to sort of try and find something from Chad and next thing go and put on the headline. He wouldn't want to interview me at all, because there's a trust you develop with artists, and that's why they asked for me again, because I've never been about the headline, never been about blah 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 whatever. It's always been about the music and about the artist.
Which leads me to the next question, which is on Lemmy from Motörhead. You had the chance to interview him, the late great Lemmy. Can you talk about that first experience interviewing him and how you prepared? Because you were told ahead of time that Lemmy didn't have patience for journalists who didn't do their homework.
Absolutely, yes. I was warned by half a dozen journalists that Lemmy was not going to be easy to interview, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. So I made sure I researched a hell of a lot of stuff about Lemmy. I wanted to ask questions that engaged him rather than being asked the same thing over and over again. So when the time came, it was a phone interview, the first one, and I could tell straight away he was like, the wall was already up, so he started, I asked him questions, and he really put me through my paces, really made me sort of work at it. But then suddenly I noticed the wall was starting to come down, he started opening up a bit more to me, and finally after the interview was over, he said to me, Joe, that was a bloody great interview. And I want you to come backstage and meet me and hang out with me when I'm in Australia in about 6 months' time on tour.
Whoa, what a thrill.
It was absolutely fantastic. And I just felt like, wow, and I won him over in that sense. So when he came out to Australia with Motörhead, I did, I got to meet him. He was absolutely wonderful. I gave him that interview that I did because it was published. He sat there and he read it in front of me and he was going, this is really great, He says, have yourself a Jack Daniels, make yourself comfortable. Made me feel so welcome. And it was basically just me and Lemmy. And he had a sort of a lady sort of friend with him in the corner there. But absolutely wonderful guy. He was really witty, intelligent.
I was going to say intelligent that's sometimes misunderstood about him.
Yeah, look, from as all the artists I've met, Lemmy was the real deal. He was the real rock star. He absolutely a true gentleman, And again, I mean, you talk to anybody who knew Lemmy, they'll say the same thing. Absolutely a wonderful guy. So one of my highlights of my career, that's for sure.
So when you get to the point where you got a difficult question to ask, and this is again regarding Lemmy, there was a time that there were rumors on the internet that he was bisexual. So you asked the question, his response was very honest, but were you concerned? How do you approach something like that? You wait until you feel it's the right time?
Yes, that's right. You wait for the right time. You sort of, I asked him that later on as his wall was coming down, but also you ask in the manner that he knows you're sort of curious about. You're not trying to sort of rile him up as in like try and get him sort of going to say something. You just sort of say, look, I understand. Why do these people say that? And the way he responded was absolutely fantastic. It was, this is a classic Lemmy response, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but you're right. It's the TMZ approach is to kind of poke him until he gets so pissed off. And here we go. We got it. We got the footage. Put it out there. But that's right. Yeah, you have just a genuine interest in these artists, as I do and so many music fans do. You're more curious as how they really feel. And I think that they appreciate that for sure. You know what it's like to be the musician. It's not all glamorous. You include a chapter on your experience in Sweden. Another one on the day-to-day schedule of Joe Satriani and Stevie Vai during their G3 tour. So you got the rehearsal, you got the show, you got interviews, check in and out of hotels, traveling schedules, all that stuff. So for those musicians just starting out who are listening right now, what is your advice for when they start hitting the road and they start playing gigs? What's the key to surviving long term?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's about doing it for the love of music, and it's a lifestyle. It's basically, I have a lot of young bands say to me about, we want to get rich and all that sort of stuff. And I say, well, if you want to, if you do it for the money, I suggest you become a lawyer because you can make a hell of a lot more as a lawyer. I say you got to do it for the love of music, and you got to realize it's hard work. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. I have an issue with a lot of these reality shows like American Idol and sort of stuff because it sort of shows. What notice well, like you don't go. They're going from like bedroom to playing to say a sold out arena, right? Because of the show, and that's not really the way to build a career, a long lasting career. I mean, all these artists I've interviewed, like everybody from like Alice Cooper, it takes a number of albums to build a career, and it's constantly touring. So what I say, my advice is just to go out there, play as many shows as you can, build your following. Obviously, utilize social media because that's really important nowadays, but do it for love, have a rapport with your audience, just play for the love of it, because if you're genuine in what you do, the audience will pick up on it, you know, and that's how you have your fans that will stay with you right to the end. And don't be so hell bent on a record deal, because these days record deals aren't really what they used to be like, and it's about having control of your music and having control of your career. So I'll just say, look, go out and play as many gigs as you can, build a following, and do it for the right reasons, which is the love of music.
And touring can put a strain on relationships. There are some who have been able to have long marriages and are still happily married. You mentioned before we started recording, you interviewed Michael Anthony of Van Halen. He comes to mind. Married his, I think, his childhood sweetheart, right?
That's
his
right,
high school sweetheart, right? Still married. Charlie Watts of the Stones. John Bon Jovi, married to his high school sweetheart. Can you talk about why it's so difficult? And is there a secret to a successful relationship while being on the road all the time? Just from your own personal experience and also from what musicians tell you about all of that.
I think the most successful ones are the ones who, their wives understand what is involved. So, you got to understand that being a musician means you're going to be away from home quite a lot. You got to be able to understand that at the outset and be able to support. If you can't, that's how a lot of marriages end up, because it is a lonely existence for both. You're on the road, yep, you're playing to fans, but your wife's back home, they might be struggling with the kids. So it's not an easy life. But if you are both on the same page and both support each other, it will work. The ones that don't work, yes, that's right. They're the ones who sort of they might say, oh, you've changed now, you're a big rock star, but that's probably because they didn't ever realize from day one that what was involved. It's not this glamorous life, because really that glamorous lifestyle is an illusion, it's not reality. Reality is you don't go out to parties every day, and as you know, for example, we mentioned David Lee Roth at the start, yes, he's pretty much out there guy, but seriously, if you're a lead singer and you're doing a show every night and you go out and party every night, that's going to basically affect your health eventually and your voice. You've got to be able to be in your top form if you want, to be successful. So there's a lot of sort of balance. It's a balancing act between, doing the stuff that you need to be done and looking after yourself, as well as, having fun, obviously, too. But it's really hard sort of balance to do it. But if you want to be successful, you got to do it.
Yeah, it's like an alternate world that they slip into, the rock star world. But then when they walk off stage, a lot of them will tell you, my wife's telling me to go out and take the trash out. I'm no different than you guys, yeah. But the image is there because you want to present this image. You want to be somebody who's a larger than life rock star. And some of those guys, nowadays it's hard to keep your personal life out of the public eye. It's more difficult now just because everybody's got a camera phone and they can catch you when you're doing all kinds of stuff. But back in the day, you could just carefully craft that image. I would imagine it's not as easy nowadays.
Oh, it's not. No, look, the one thing I noticed when I go on tour is a lot of my fans who meet me for the first time in other countries say to me, "Oh, you look exactly the same as you do on Facebook, for example." And I go, "Well, yeah, because I don't post anything that's not real. I post things that are real, because that's right. Fans, if you start posting stuff, you all this sort of glamorous image, and then you go on the road and they see you in this different state, they're going to go, what's going on here? This is not real, So I understand the whole thing. I grew up in a whole generation like yourself where, it's rock stars were bigger, larger than life, and it's nice that is a sort of how they are. But nowadays it's all been blown, with, like you said, with phones, exactly what's going on. So you got to be genuine. Today, I think it's most important thing is you got to be real, authentic, and just be who you are.
You say in the book that the bigger the star, the more pressure they tend to be under, and this leads to a meltdown at times, and you witnessed Billy Corgan's meltdown while he was on stage during a solo show in 2005, and he was trying to establish himself as a solo artist, distance himself from the Smashing Pumpkins, but the crowd kept shouting out, "Pumpkins, Pumpkins," and he got pissed, stormed off stage. So as a musician and journalist, what are you thinking at that point? You were in the audience that night. Do you understand his frustration more because you're a musician, or are you thinking with a journalist mind and saying, that's not right? You got people that paid for a ticket.
I was thinking more of a musician point of view, because I know what it's like. I understand that, as you become more successful, the pressure builds on you, especially if you're the main songwriter where, all the hits, you write the hits, and if you don't start writing hits, the label starts coming down on you and say, well, if you don't write another hit, we're going to drop you. So there's so much pressure. So the thing with Billy was he had, Smashing Pumpkins, it was so successful, and then he wanted to sort of go out by himself and do something on his own. And unfortunately, it's a really hard road to do that, because you've developed a persona with a certain band that people know you for. So and then to go out by yourself to play songs that, you know, something new that you want to do, which is totally different. I mean, the Future Embraces, the album that he had out, is totally different to anything he's done with Smashing Pumpkins. You know, sort of gaze that towards the last album they did in the late '90s. But yeah, look, I saw it as a mindset. I could understand, you know, and all those audiences, all they were worried about is they wanted to sort of have the hits because they'll pay the tickets. We want the hits, But unfortunately, he didn't want to do that, you know, and that's why I had that meltdown. So I could understand and empathize with him, the pressure he was under.
Yeah, I could too. I mean, he is human. These guys are human. That's the other thing that people need to understand. These are human beings. They're flawed. You know, they
absolutely, yeah. They're not supermen, you know. They're just like everybody else.
You mentioned Death Cab for Cutie in your book, and that's one of my favorite of the newer bands that are out there. I really love Death Cab for Cutie. And I got to be honest, I had no idea that most people knew him through the OC because I never watched that show. But we'll get to that in a sec. But yeah, you've had to deal with no shows. Can you talk about your experience with Chris Walla of Death Cab for Cutie? A no show first time around, but a better second time around, right?
Yeah. First time around, he just sort of didn't turn up for his interview, you know. And I got all these excuses from the manager, but I think he didn't give a shit basically about doing an interview. I think, but the second time around, like I mentioned in my book, he sort of didn't even remember that really, you know. But he was a lot better that time, and I was really glad he did because, you know, he was actually a really nice guy and a great musician. But again, you know, I suppose being on tour so much, you know, and then you got to do that press day. A lot of artists just go, "Do we have to do this?" And they just disappear, you know. But again, from a musician point of view, I could understand that. But if I was purely about a headline, I would then say, well, you know, look at this guy. He doesn't care about, you know, this, and you could write anything you want to make it go in the way you want to go. And that's the thing about people need to be aware of when they read something in the magazine is it's a writer's perception of how they write something to make you go with what they want you to go. So you could make anything go in a direction that you want to and paint a picture of a certain artist the way you want to. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but I'm always about making sure that the facts are there and just observing. I mean, I just observed. That's what happened to me. I wrote exactly what happened to me, and yeah, I'm glad that the second time around it proved to be better.
Yeah, and this leads again to a question regarding what to ask and what not to ask. So in Walla's case, you're told not to ask any questions about their association with the TV show The OC, which it featured the band's music, and they were also written into the fictional narrative of the show, as you write. Can you talk about why you were given that request, and how did you respond to that? Does it depend? Is it situation to situation, or do you say, hey, I'm going to ask whatever the hell I want to ask?
That's a very good question. Now, that one there, they wanted to sort of distance themselves, and because they were becoming sort of people just calling them like the band that was on OC, you know, and I understand as a musician that, you know, you don't want to get sort of what's the word for it? Tagged with, you know, labeled as one band from a certain thing and not know for the rest of your music, which I could understand. You do get at times lists from publicists that say, don't ask the artist this question, because if you do, it's going to be, they'll just shut down interview. Now, you have a choice in that one. It's either, so if I am there purely for the headline, I would basically go, right, I don't care what you say, I'm going to ask him this. And if it gets shut down, then you've got your headline of artist, you know, runs, you know, shuts down interview. There's your headline. But I'm not about that. I wanted to make sure that it was about the music. I didn't care. If they don't want to talk about that, that's fine. But, you know, a lot of times, 95% of the time, when an artist knows you're not there for a headline, they'll open up and talk about themselves. You know, they'll say, yeah. And then you get your story. You still get your story, but in a way that's actually given to you by them rather than something you try and force out of them.
Yeah, I'm always going to respect that if somebody comes to me and says, don't ask this, because you have to be careful. A lot of times people don't forget about this. You have a reputation to keep. That's so right. Word gets around that this Joe Matera guy he's asking these questions and he's just looking for a quote. He's just looking for clickbait. Stay away from this guy. You know, so you have to be careful of that. And when they realize that you're not there to do that, then your reputation goes the other way and they'll welcome you in. Like John Mayer, I want to ask about too. He was very comfortable with you, but yeah, you have to be careful of that too. Have you ever had a situation where maybe there's a current situation going on with a particular artist where everybody's talking about it and everybody wants to know what this artist thinks, and their publicist says he's not going to talk about it? Would you just say, well, then I'm not going to do the interview because there's no reason?
No, because I there's always different topics you can, you can't just concentrate on one thing. If they don't want to talk about one thing, that's fine. That's the thing with what I do. I try and find a different avenue of what to talk about. There's always different stuff that will engage an artist. So, you can find things that they go, well, he actually wants me to ask about this and no one's ever asked me before. And so, yeah, and you're right. It's a reputation. I mean, I've got a reputation too. So if you get a reputation as someone who just cares about a headline, you won't be getting much work, and if you do, not many bands will want to, trust you with that. I've had a lot of stuff with artists who've told me stuff that they know I would never review. I mean, I've got stuff on tape. If I was a headline journalist, I would just say, well, here's the tapes. Check this out, what they told me. But I would never do that because that's breaking a trust between you and an artist, which, and that's why a lot of times artists have always called for me because they know they can trust me. They go, well, this guy, because one thing I also do, Eric, is I make sure they get the interviews I do, so they get to see my work, so they can see, oh, he actually kept to his word. He actually wrote about the music. He wrote about that. And they go, well, remember him next time we're in town. Like, we'll talk to him because we can trust him, And they do open up. They open up a lot of times, it depends on the situation. That might have been on the road for so long that they just sort of start opening up to you about all sorts of problems, maybe personal problems. And they know that you're not going to go and run to the nearest editor and say, look what he's given me. I can give you a headline. So it's very important, and relationships, especially in this industry, are really important that you keep a good reputation and respect, really, basically. It comes down to respect.
Off the record. That's another one. Off the record. Off the record means off the record, period. Although there have been some books that have come out lately, of an artist after they've passed. They put in the book what that artist at the time said off the record. Mm-hmm. What's your approach on that?
That's a good one. That's something where the legal department of a book has to look at it and make up the decision for you, because a lot of times your book does get looked over. The thing is, everything that, like in my book, is from my observation, so it's true for me. There's nothing in the book that is, accusing of anybody. It's basically what happened to me. Like you said earlier about Billy Corgan. It's what I observed, what's actually happened. Which can be verified by others who were there. But it's how you put it across. So I could have put it across in a different way. I could have said, oh, Billy was, stoned at his brain. He was totally off it. He didn't give a care about blah, blah, blah. And then it'll become much more of an accusation of, well, how do you know this? Were you there? Did you know he was off his head or something, stoned? So it's the way you write things and the honesty in it. So without, painting a picture that's not true. So that's a really good question. Off the record, when I say off the record, legally, you're not allowed to repeat anything off the record. I mean,
no matter what, right? Even if that artist passes on, they're no longer with us.
Well, as far as I know, I mean, I can't answer that from probably a person who's into the music law thing will be able to answer that for you. I haven't come across that myself, my situation. I can only write from my experience of what I know. So maybe some other author could answer that for you. But
depends on the situation.
I know, yeah.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Joe Matera is here to talk about his book, Backstage Pass, The Grit and the Glamour. So you've interviewed many metal bands over the years, and you say in the book that the heavy metal community is one of the most misunderstood genres. Why do you think that is?
Because the public tends to, those who don't understand the metal community or metal music tend to sort of judge them on the way they look and what they do. They don't understand, the music, for example, a lot of metal bands sing about death or Satan or anything like that, which is, topics that are sort of really controversial in general society. But that's theatre, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Shakespeare, he wrote books that were, it's theatre. So for me, metal music is an outlet that's really important. To let go of all your frustrations, if you got in your rage or whatever. And I think it's wonderful because, I've been to so many metal concerts. As I said, I've, interviewed so many, and they're just the most nicest guys. It's amazing. Like, there's a contrast to what they do on stage. Like a lot of metal musicians don't even listen to metal music. They listen to like jazz or classical music.
Yes, isn't that crazy? I know, it's so cool.
Crazy. Yeah, it is so cool. Look at Bruce Dickinson. He's a commercial pilot. He's a fencer. He does stuff that you wouldn't think a metal musician does, but that's the balance in it. Can you imagine if all you did was just play metal music, listen to metal music, live metals? Seriously, you'll be pretty much, go crazy, whatever, because you got to have a balance to it. So the metal musicians I met have been all wonderful guys. I mean, Iron Maiden, for example, they go off and play golf and drink, just have a beer. Or Angus Young, for example, he's a teetotaler, never touched alcohol. I mean, and here he's stage, like a demon possessed.
Chocolate milk. He loves his chocolate
absolutely.
milk.
So
That's the best.
I've got a lot of respect for metal musicians, and I think it's a very important community, and it serves its purpose as an outlet and does unite. I mean, I think the difference from a metal concert to, say, a pop concert is there's a lot more camaraderie in the metal community than there is in the pop community, I think, just from, because pop's much more about what's popular now, let's go on to the next thing. Metal is something that stays there no matter how long. I mean, look at the fans of Judas Priest. They're still there all these years. I mean, I'm a fan, still there. You don't sort of, just because, band sort of grows older, you go, oh, I'm no longer listening to them. Like pop music, there's a certain age that you go, well, time for me to mature and listen to some different music. But metal music is always there. It's really important.
There are those in the music business who are known as hired guns. This is always interesting. Musicians basically hired to perform on stage or in studio with famous bands and musicians. Brian Ray, so he's been Paul McCartney's right-hand man since 2002. He plays guitar and bass. These musicians, I find, they make for the best interviews because they've got stories to tell that have never been told because nobody's coming to them to ask. What was your experience like interviewing him? And can you share his story? He had a story about Paul and the song She Loves You, right? Paul shared a story with Brian.
Brian Ray, that's right, yeah, because hired guns, they're working with guys, like in Brian's case with Paul McCartney, and if you're working with people like that, you're going to hear stories that other people might have ever heard before, And Brian told me one about a story that the Beatles song "She Loves You," where Paul said to Brian that his father had been out for the day, and when he returned home, him and John had written "She Loves You." So Paul asked his father, "Have a listen to it. Tell me what you think." So they start singing "She Loves You," yeah, 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 and then his father goes to him, "Oh, look, it's very good, Paul, but I think there is enough Americanisms in the vernacular right now. Why don't you consider changing it to "She loves you, yes, yes, yes."
I love those stories. Those are gold because you've heard every story that's out there from those guys. But again, the hired guns, guys like that are hanging around in the studio, and they get some of these stories that we don't know because nobody's ever come to them. So I always love talking to those guys. How about, there's one on the Shadows that you have in the book too, because you said when you first picked up the guitar in 1981, one of the albums you now consider your guitar school was the Shadows' 20 Golden Greats from 1977, and you eventually had the chance to interview guitarist Hank Marvin. And there's a saying, never meet your heroes, because sometimes they don't live up to what you'd hoped. Yeah. This was not the case for you, and you led right away with how much of a fan of his work you were, and he was delighted to hear that, and great interview from then on. This is one where you broke the 20-minute rule, right?
That's right. Yes, the 20-minute rule. I got to talk to him a bit longer than that because he just really connected with me, and told me some great stories about the Shadows and the recording process. And then later on, as I said in the book, he starts asking me about my band. He's really interested, in what I do. It's like, wow, someone's, I'm not here. It's not about me. It's about you. But this is, a guy who's influenced nearly every British guitar player of that generation, and he's asking about my music, so absolutely wonderful guy. And yes, there is a saying, never meet your heroes because you might be disappointed, and that day I certainly wasn't disappointed. It's interesting because I got to interview Hank again a couple of years ago. I did an article for Guitar World, if people want to see, it's online, about the history of instrumental music, and we chatted again, and he sort of remembered that interview, and again he was just as wonderful as he was on the day that I met him the first time in what I wrote about in the book. And recently I actually recorded I wrote an original instrumental that's a tribute to the Shadows with all the sort of same sort of style of music, and I sent it off to Hank. Hank gave it the endorsement, so he's actually endorsed it, which is fantastic. So wow. I'm going to actually release that at some point in the future, and but just to have his endorsement, it just means so much to me because here I am as a fan learning the guitar from him. Later on, years later, get to interview him, do an article and that sort of stuff, and then again years later, I write a track that's endorsed by him. It's almost like coming full circle. I mean, how has sort of it's like a pinch me moment sort of thing. It's like, wow, a truly wonderful guy. I mean, you don't get any bigger than sort of Hank Marvin.
Yeah. Any other gets that you'd love to get? Any other musicians that you say, man, I'd love to interview him or her?
Oh, look, there's been a couple I love to. I mean, Jimmy Page would be one I love to sort of chat.
Yeah.
Especially because I know he's into sort of like the occult stuff, like Crowley and all sorts of stuff. And I spent some years sort of into that sort of stuff that he likes. So that'd be an interesting topic to sort of talk to him about. But again, you sort of just can't go in there and just start talking to him about that because he's very, he doesn't talk much about that. But Jimmy's great. I love to talk to him. And Dave Gilmour's another one I would love to, because I think Dave Gilmour is just, I think he has so many stories that we haven't heard. We always hear the same thing about Pink Floyd. I think if we sort of sit down and just chat like two friends in the pub and just share stories, I think he would tell some stories that we would have never heard before.
I just interviewed David Payton from the band Pilot. He wrote the song "Oh, oh, oh, It's Magic."
It's magic.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Now he was the bassist for Jimmy Page on the sessions for the Charles Bronson movie Death Wish 2.
That's right.
And he said, and I said, what was that like just watching Jimmy Page work? And he's like, because he's like, look, I'm a musician, but I'm a fan, and I'm watching this guy. And he said there was a really cool moment where one of the scenes they were playing they would be watching the movie and then playing while watching. And Jimmy Page said, this is a real dark scene. Let's do something. And he took a penny. He's like, just slide it down the fretboard, it'll make a real eerie sound. I was like, oh man, I'd love to be there, Yeah. I'd love to be there when that stuff goes down, You talked to Ray Manzarek of The Doors, Brian May of Queen, George Martin too. That's the other one you interviewed.
Yeah.
All of them very nice. All of them very nice.
Absolutely. I've been lucky in that sense. There's only been a couple of interviews where, you get deflated after you've interviewed a person. One of them is Gene Simmons, just for the fact that Gene's always been about the commercialization of Kiss. It's always talking about I think every second question he answered it with go to genesimmons.com or go to kiss.com.
I love Gene.
And fair enough. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Gene because he has taken something and made it into a brand, sort of thing. And he admitted to myself, he admitted that Kiss were never really about being proficient on the instruments, about making music that was accessible to everybody so they could become, as in his own words, Kissanity, create a new religion.
Yes, and he'd rather be considered a performer rather than a musician.
That's right, absolutely. So and he admitted to there's been times on some of the early albums where they swapped instruments and it's not who you think is playing. For example, Ace Frehley, you might think it's him. It's actually someone else. It could be, say, Paul Stanley. So, but yeah, so George Martin was absolutely wonderful. Again,
I mean, he's royalty.
Royalty, yeah, absolutely. So there was about 100 journalists on the list to interview him, and he shortlisted down to about 20 interviews, I think it was, and I was one of them. And I'll never forget the day I got the email saying you've been chosen, handpicked by Sir George Martin to interview him. And I go, wow. So I spent the next few weeks just researching as much as I could because I thought, right, what do you ask a man who's probably been asked every single question about the Beatles possible? So I just tried to find together some questions that were engaging and that were different as far as I could from my research. And yeah, it went down really well. We spent half an hour together. He answered all my questions. He spoke about the Revolver, spoke about John Lennon, spoke about his favorite guitar player being Jeff Beck, absolutely fantastic guitar player. And just spoke about the industry in general, how it was actually heading down the road to where it is now. He sort of really predicted where the industry was going. I mean, he was just amazing how he sort of could see that it wasn't going in a good place, how like how we got now Spotify and how the artists are sort of missing out on stuff. So wonderful interview. And I got to meet Lady Martin and one of the highlights, really.
That's a consistency with all three of those guys, Ray Manzarek, Brian May, and George Martin. They all enjoy talking about their most famous project or what they're most connected to. Ray Manzarek loved flying the flag of the Doors. Brian May loved flying the flag of Queen. And George Martin, apparently, from what you're saying, proud of what he did with the Beatles, because that can sometimes you have artists that don't necessarily want to go back and talk about a particular period of their life. but they always
That's
are
right.
proud of that. But that's why
Absolutely.
Queen is still so big. The Doors, Ray Manzarek, he was the guy that would always be out there praising the work of Jim Morrison and the Doors.
Absolutely, it's great. And it's great when they talk about that because it is. I mean, it's a legacy they leave, and they're associated with that. I mean, Sir George Martin will always be associated with the Beatles, regardless. Known as the fifth Beatle, I mean, he's done so much other stuff too. Like he produced the Jeff Beck albums, a couple of those albums there, and all these other artists. But at the end of the day, it's the Beatles' legacy he'll be most aligned with all the time.
Now, you interviewed a musician who is from a city not far from me here in Connecticut, and I mentioned him earlier, John Mayer. He's from Fairfield, Connecticut.
Yeah.
So he's like 45 minutes to an hour from
wow.
where I am here. Yeah. So you interviewed him prior to when he fell into the trappings of fame and fortune, and he admitted that too. Can you talk about your experiences with him?
That's a really great story with John. So John came out to Australia just as the record, the album. I've gone blank now. The album that sort of started getting traction on radio. So
the one that broke.
No one knew. Sorry.
Okay, so this is the one that he broke through with. Was it Squares or something? What's the?
Yes, Squares. That's right. Yes.
Is that it's okay? Yeah, I can look it up.
So when he came out, no one knew who he was. I didn't even know who he was. I just got this press release saying, this singer-songwriter from America has got this album called and he's coming out to do a showcase. So I was invited to the showcase, and there was only about 20 people at this really sort of dingy sort of inner city sort of bar, and most of them who were there were more interested in having their free alcohol and just sort of checking out who this guy guitar plays. So John's on stage. He's playing all these tunes, no one's sort of really taking much note. And, I can sense that, this is a guy who's really extremely, talented on the guitar and has got some great songs. And he got to the last song and he could see that he wasn't winning, many people over. So he decided to throw in a cover of Stevie Ray Vaughan's Lemmy, right? And which is, he just played it, and all of a sudden, everybody just swarmed in front. And they go, wow. And he just did this amazing cover, one of the best covers I've ever sort of heard from an artist. And he won everybody over. And I knew straight down, I thought, well, this guy's going to be going places. So what happened then was 6 months later, he broke. He was becoming a really big star in Australia. So he came out again, and I got to sort of interview him again. He remembered everything in detail, where we were, what we talked about. And I thought, wow, this guy is pretty switched on. He remembers me. He must have done hundreds of interviews since then. So we got on really well, and he opened up to me, and he just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the following year he came out again, and he asked for me again personally, and he offered me tickets again to the show. And then after, I think it was the fourth time, he got so big that it's sort of like he started falling into the trappings of sort of fame and fortune. You could see that shift in him, how he's becoming a bit more sort of not who he was at the start. So, and unfortunately, I lost contact with him ever since. So, but I think he's now starting to sort of go back to where he was at the beginning, his guitar playing. So I think he's going for the whole sort of celebrity cycle and coming out of it back to where he was.
Well, what's interesting is now he's with Dead and Company, and he won over Dead fans. I saw him performing, and it's legit. By the way, Room for Squares. That was the
Room for Squares. That's the one.
Yeah, on stage, you could just tell he's part of an ensemble. Like he's humbled, and he's learned his lesson, and I think he writes about it in his music. He learned. He's a kid. He's a kid, and all of a sudden he's got all this fame and fortune. And he was dating these famous girls, and
that's right. Yeah, and I'll never forget it. Every time he interviewed, I got to interview him. He showed me his latest tattoo. So he started out with having, like, I think 1 or 2 tattoos. When he came out 6 months later, he had another 5 and 6. And then when he came out a year later, he had another. And he just kept showing me. He says, "Oh, this is where I got that at." And it was just amazing seeing this whole story happening in front of me.
So the music journalism business has changed quite a bit since you began. Print publications were taken over by the internet. So what's the most challenging part of being a rock journalist today, and what are the upsides to it?
Yeah, it has changed a lot. I mean, nowadays, I think anybody who writes a blog think they're a music journalist, and it's not, because it doesn't work that way. I mean, yes, we've got access where you can, write a blog and that sort of stuff, but that doesn't necessarily make you a music journalist. I mean, there's a hell of a lot more involved in that sort of stuff. So, but having said that, I've come across some great blogs written by really passionate fans, which you could tell, they really know their artists. So, and that's wonderful, But yeah, it has changed a lot. It becomes it's a lot harder now to sort of get into this. I've been lucky that I've got a background, and I've done all the different magazines, but nowadays, yeah, it's much more people tend to sort of read magazines online. And one thing I have noticed with the print editions is, back in the day, like for example, Guitar Player, if you go back to the 80s, they had the interviews are really in depth, really long. Now interviews in a lot of magazines are much more shorter, because the attention span has changed. Everybody's on the phone, so they don't want to read something that goes for like 3 pages. I'll read something in 1 page. So it's a lot more challenging to write a story within a certain amount of words compared to what you could do years ago. So it has changed, but the benefit now is, yes, there's a lot more outlets out there. There's a lot more people can see your work now. Like a lot of print publications will, once it's been out on the streets, they will upload the articles online so people can get to sort of read it who can't get a hard copy. So nowadays I can get a lot more people will be able to read my articles, because not only it's in print, it's also online. So there's a lot of benefits to it, as well as the non-benefits.
I'm sure you've gotten people that have reached out to you about an article you wrote like 10 years ago, because it's still on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
I do. And they say, "Oh, you wrote this article," and you go, "Oh,"
and you
really?
almost forgot. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, because I've done so much since then. It's hard to remember everything you do, but it's great when they do that, because you sort of go, "Oh, really?" And you check it out again and go, "Oh, wow!" And it brings up memories again, And it's interesting because sometimes you'll see an old interview and you go, "Well, I've interviewed that person, say, a year ago, and here he is where I did interview, say, 10 years ago. He's such a different person." Like it's really, really interesting.
Here's one question from one writer to another. My biggest challenge was always the lead. If I can come up with the lead, something that would pull. My dad always taught me that. My dad was a writer. You got to have a good lead. Once you get that lead, everything else. Do you start with that? Do you build the body of the article first and then say, let me write the lead based on what I write? How does that work for you?
That's a good question. I struggle with that. Yeah, I think once I have the lead happening, once I've got that intro sentence that really grabs your attention, it all flows. If I can't get that, I can be on it for days. Sometimes I'll just start writing the body of the interview and do a story, but it has to have a lead somewhere to start. So it's coming up with that. I eventually get there, obviously, but sometimes it's easier. Sometimes it's a lot harder. I think one interview took me 1 week just to come up with the lead, but once I got the lead, I wrote it in a few hours. It was really easy.
But it is funny too. There's no explanation behind it. Like sometimes I'll feel just inspired to write something that's just flowing out of me, and other times I'll just sit there and I'll just stare at it, and it's just like nothing. I don't feel anything, and it's like you start to get pissed off. It's like, come on, or well, maybe you'll do this. Like, do you put on some music, something to kind of inspire you, get you in the right mindset, something that
I tend to sort of walk away from it, just go out or do something different, or play my guitar or whatever, just something that just takes my brain away from trying to think. Because I'm like you, I sit there and I go, this is not going anywhere. I could sit there for an hour and it just frustrates me. But once it flows, it flows.
You must have had too, like where you've had articles where you're happy with, but you have other articles where you're like, no, this is it. But then somebody says, I love that article you wrote. And you're like, oh, well, I thought that was okay, but I was happy with the other one. Like the audience, when they read it, they receive it differently than when you write it.
Absolutely. Like, you always say your best work is the one you do now, you're always trying to improve on it. And that's true. Like, I look back at some of my early interviews and go, wow, gee, I would have written that differently. But that's how it is. It's like music, when I, do my own music, or any artist, you talk to any artist, I'll say the same thing. If they look back on say an album they did a few years ago, or they say, I wish I did that differently. But again, where do you stop? You could do that with everything. You'll never stop. So I look at it as a moment in time. That's what you did. That's where you're at. That's your work. Be happy with it. Now you're in a different place.
So the book is out now, Joe Matera's Backstage Pass, The Grit and the Glamour, and it's basically available wherever books are sold, Amazon, all the usual places, right?
That's right. Yeah, Amazon. Amazon's probably the best place you can get it. But yeah, any place that sells a good book, you'll be able to get it.
And where can people find your work and find you online?
They can find me. I've got a website, just joematera.com. I'm on Facebook, which you can find me. I'm very accessible. I'm always happy to hear from fans, and people can send me friend requests, and we can chat about music, whatever. Always happy to answer any questions people may have, about my book or my music or anything, music in general. Because I always believe that the beauty about the internet is you can interact with others and fans and people, and I think being a writer, as you know yourself too, it's a very lonely existence. You know, you put your work out there and you never hear anything. You don't know whether, people enjoyed it. So when you see comments online or, people write you just an email, say, "Oh, I really enjoyed your work," you feel good. You go, "Oh, I'm doing something that's, giving back to the community," or what, someone's getting something from it, which is fantastic. So yeah, I'm always about communicating.
All right, Joe, thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you so much for your interest, mate. I'm really glad you enjoyed the book, and some great questions, really, really great questions. I love it, get asked questions like that. I mean, it puts me in the opposite seat where, you get quizzed by someone who's very knowledgeable like you, and you really read the book. And again, that's a good thing about how you can tell a good journalist is someone who's actually done the research or actually knows what they're talking about, and you definitely did that. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much for the interest, and it's been a pleasure to be on your podcast.
That's it. It's in the books.